After the theory about this keyword, now comes the practice. So let's start and simply log the this keyword for this global execution context. So all we have to do is console.log this. And what can we expect here? All right. So all this means is that the this keyword in the global execution context is very simply the window object. And that makes sense, right? That's because the window object is the default object, as we learned in the last lecture. Okay, let's comment out this part of the code and let's write a simple function. And once again, we're going back to our calculate age function, because we already know that so well. All right, so console.log 2016 minus the year. And what we also want here is to console log the this keyword once again. This. All right, and when we call this function, what can we expect this time? Actually, we have to write the function call up here. So calculate age, I'm going to go with 1985. So let's refresh this and try to guess what we're going to see now. So we first have the result of 31, which comes from this log here, and then the this variable is once again the window object. So does this make any sense to you? I hope so, because this is a regular function call and not a method. As we learned in the last lecture, in a regular function call, the this keyword always points to the window object. And it actually makes sense, because the object that this function is attached to is the global object. And it actually makes sense, because the object that this function is attached to is the global object. So it has to be the this variable here as well. Okay, so not a method, a regular function call. So the this variable is the global object. So let's move on to an object here. And we'll go back to our old John object. So name, John. And here's not a semicolon, but the normal comma. Then year of birth is 1990. And let's now add a method here, and it will be our calculate age method once again. So calculate age, and once again this is a little bit different than what we had before, right? Because this is like a function expression and not a function declaration. So in here we can also console log this keyword. But first of all, we have to perform the method call. And that's as simple as this. So we use John and then we use to calculate age method on it. So what's going to happen now? And let me actually comment out this part of the code. All right. So the this variable now is the John object, and it makes absolute sense, right? Because as we know, the this keyword refers to the object that called the method, and in this case it was the John object, so of course it has to be the this variable. And we actually already saw this in action before in the introductory lecture about objects, but at the time we didn't really understand it, but now it makes total sense why the this keyword refers to the John object, right? And now it also makes sense why we can then use this to calculate John's age. So console log this dot year of birth, right? So let's run this again, sorry. And then we have final result. No, of course not, because it's of course 2016 minus this. All right, here we go. Now let's take this even a bit further here. And what we're going to do is to add a function inside of the calculate age function or method. So I'm simply going to call it inner function, okay? So this function will not really do anything. I just want to console log the this keyword in here as well. Alright, and then we can call it, of course, inner function, and just like this, because it doesn't have any parameters. So now when we call the calculate age method down here, not only will these two console logs here happen, right, but also this function will be declared and then called, and therefore the this keyword will be logged as well. And now try to guess what the this keyword is going to be like. Alright, so once again the this keyword in here is the John object as expected. Then the outcome is of course 26 as we had before. But now comes something that looks rather strange, right? And that's the fact that the this keyword in this inner function here is now back to being the window. And this is a bit counterintuitive, right? And in fact, some people in the JavaScript community agree with this and others don't agree. Some people think that the this keyword in here should still be the object, this is the John object, right? But to me, actually, it makes sense that it's not, because it's simply the rule. And the rule is that when a regular function call happens, then the default object is the window object. At least that's how it happens in the browser. So once again, this is not a method, because the method is calculate age, so it's a method of the John object. But this function here, although it's written inside of a method, it's still a regular function. So when we call it, the this keyword will no longer point to the John object, but instead point to the window object. Okay, and this is something very important to keep in mind for the future and also for a future project. And now that this is really crystal clear, let's now complicate things a little bit more. So remember how I said that the this variable is only assigned a value as soon as an object calls a method? So I said this was important, so let's now see an example. And for that, I'm going to create another object, which will be called Mike. Var Mike will be another object, and this name will now be Mike, of course, the year of birth can be something like 1984. Alright. Now imagine that we want to calculate the age of Mike. So one thing that we could do is of course to go ahead and copy this calculate method here and paste it here in the Mike object. But we could be really smart and instead do something that's actually a very common practice in JavaScript and that we will also use more in the future, and that's something called method borrowing. So we are going to borrow John's method to use it on Mike. And how are we going to do it? It's very simple. We just say that we want Mike.calculateAge to be John.calculateAge. Simple, right? So you see that in this case we don't have the parentheses, because these parentheses are for calling a function. And now we simply treat the function here as a variable. And so we can say that we want the Mike.calculateAge function to be the exact same as John.calculateAge function, which is this one here, right? Alright, so if we now go ahead and use a function calculateAge, because now I want to really call it, so I use the parentheses. So now I'm going to go ahead and call the function. But first I will actually make it a bit simpler. So I don't want this code here anymore to get in my way. So I'm now going to call it, and what are we going to see? Alright, so from the John calculate age call here comes the John object and the 26 age of John. So exactly what we had before. But when we now call the calculate age method for Mike, which we had borrowed, then the object becomes the Mike object and now we have Mike's age here. So this is truly amazing, right? And this proves what I had said in the beginning, which is that the this variable is only assigned a value when the object calls the method. So if it wouldn't be like this, then this variable here would always be John, right? Because it's in fact attached to the John object. But when we now call the same method from the Mike object, then the this variable becomes the Mike object. So again, the this keyword only becomes something as soon as the method gets called. And this is something really important once again. Okay, so I hope that this is really crystal clear now. And with this, we reach the end of our theoretical lectures. And for me, it's really good to see that you're still with me after all of these more theoretical lectures. And believe me that these lectures were really worth it, and they will absolutely make you a better developer over time. And even if you don't understand it now, I'm sure that you will eventually. And so from now on, we can build on what we've learned so far, and we can now focus even more on coding. So let's continue doing that right now. See you in the next lecture.